All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar hosted by the Great Plains Institute, where we will be sharing insights from our inaugural Environmental Justice Fellow, Vilas Annavarapu. I'm Bridget Callahan, and I've worked at GPI for the past 3 years as its Carbon Action Alliance Manager. I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I've had the great pleasure of working closely with Vilas throughout his fellowship over the past year and a half. Before his presentation today, I'm here to share a bit of background about the Great Plains Institute, or as we like to call it, GPI. We're a nonpartisan nonprofit organization that focuses on climate and energy policy. Our mission is to accelerate the transition to net zero carbon emissions for the benefit of people, the economy, and the environment. And part of that work is really focusing on decarbonizing all major emission sectors. At GPI, we have teams dedicated to working on renewables like wind and solar, folks working in energy systems, people working specifically with communities, supporting local climate action plans, transportation and fuels, and industrial innovation and carbon management. Vilas and I are both part of the Industrial Innovation and Carbon Management team, where we're working on reducing industrial emissions and developing carbon management solutions that help remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And just for some background, when we say carbon management, we're talking about a suite of big industrial scale technologies that can capture, transport, store, reuse, and remove CO2 from different power and industrial facilities in order to keep it from going into the atmosphere. And I am going to share a link for an explainer to learn a bit more about that. So our work involves a lot of education, research, and advocacy. While we don't support specific projects, we do aim to meet communities where they are and provide information so people can make informed choices about their energy futures. And through this work, we've come to understand that community engagement and environmental justice are absolutely critical to the energy transition and meeting those net zero goals. These elements ensure that solutions are equitable, inclusive, and informed by those who are most directly affected. And so centering frontline communities helps address the historic injustices that have taken place with infrastructure build out in our country and also build trust. And we know that local input leads to more effective and long lasting outcomes. And so that understanding is really what led us to launch the Carbon Management Environmental Justice Fellowship in 2023. And the goal of this fellowship is to help bring environmental justice voices and perspectives into the fast evolving space of carbon management policy, research, and project development. We've recognized that that is a really important need for our work, and we've been incredibly fortunate to have Vilas as our inaugural fellow. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Vilas to introduce himself and share more about his work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bridget. And thank you, everyone on this call, for taking time out of your day to hear some of my experiences and reflections on doing environmental justice work in the climate space and in the carbon management space. Over the course of this webinar, I'm really excited to share some of those big lessons that I've learned and hope to end by reflecting on together what a just and equitable climate transition looks like. I'm really grateful for the Great Plains Institute, for Bridget for moderating this panel and for being such a great support system over the course of my fellowship, and also to my parents because I'm at their house right now and they'd be mad at me if I didn't shout them out. I'm going to start by sharing this major reflection. Climate spaces need more on-ramps. My background isn't in climate. I went to the University of Virginia to study political science, which meant I was really good at reading books and writing papers. But climate, I didn't know as much about. I didn't have a technical background. I was a little scared of doing science-related work. But it was incredibly clear to me that climate change is a major problem that we need all our energy to figure out how to solve. But before I got to that step, I first moved to Mississippi. I taught sixth grade computer science at a Title I school right on Jackson State University's campus. Sixth graders are crazy and stressful, but they're also really lovely and wonderful in a lot of amazing ways. And my life was changed by getting to work as an educator. The top right photo is me and my friend hosting an after-school frisbee camp. Students weren't allowed to play sports as sixth graders, which is sort of absurd to ask a 12 or 11-year-old to sit all day and not have any sort of movement or activity. So we decided we'd just have a fun activity for students to do after school. And it was a really lovely way to build relationships and get to know young people. And what I loved so much about what I was teaching, computer science, was that I was able to work with kids to show them that when they worked really hard, put their mind towards solving a puzzle, they could be really successful. You just had to keep working at it, and the results would show themselves immediately. I knew that because I had no background in computer science. When I started this program, my program coordinator was like, stay two steps ahead of a 12-year-old and you'll be all right. So I did my best for 2 years. I transitioned out of teaching and decided that I wanted to work more directly with young people and unleash their creative energy and potential. I founded a local nonprofit called Riverside Collective, and in partnership with several of the students that I'd worked with, I opened a worker-owned coffee shop and ice cream shop and after-school entrepreneurship program in South Jackson. The goal was simple: empower the Jackson community through sustainable and cooperative growth. I wanted my students to recognize that their knowledge, their expertise extends beyond the classroom. And when they put their minds together, they can do really wonderful, thoughtful things for the community. It's my connection and care for young people too that made me realize the big issues that we're dealing with climate are going to impact them so much more than they impact me, and future generations so much more than they impact me. They already impact me a lot. And I wanted to use my expertise around community engagement, working with people, creating things that didn't exist before, and think about how that translated really well into the climate space. How can we leverage the expertise and knowledge of young people, of community members, and envision a shared understanding of what a just and equitable climate future can look like? The Great Plains Institute's Environmental Justice Fellowship gave me the opportunity to do that, not having any background in climate, to really immerse myself and learn about what climate change looked like and what my role and what my contribution could be in moving us towards that more equitable future. The fellowship structure is 15 months. The first 3 months were dedicated entirely to research and learning. So I got paid to read a bunch of books and read a bunch of journal articles, and it was awesome. It was really, really wonderful. And I got to ask questions to an amazing team on the carbon management team and across GPI who had a lot more expertise in this work than I did. And I got to bring my own frames to it. I got to think about Mississippi. I got to think about Jackson and how any sort of climate intervention that I'd learned about would impact the people that I cared about and that I lived near. After that initial 3 month dedicated research and learning, I was in charge of executing a 12-month long action project, which I'll talk about in a few moments. What I liked so much about this model and what really drew me to it was that the carbon management team at GPI was willing to invest in me. They were willing to say, for 3 months, we really want you to learn and research and read and figure out what your role in this space looks like. Similarly, with the 12-month action project, I was able to use my own knowledge of Mississippi, Mississippi's needs, Jackson's needs, and create a project that took my expertise, the expertise of my team, and thought about how to make really big impact. And I had support the entire time. Finally, what I liked so much about the structure was that the project was built for community members. It wasn't so GPI or the Industrial Innovation and Carbon Management team could get their name plastered on a fancy report that I could share on LinkedIn. It was to really understand and assess the needs of community groups that we were in partnership with and understand how we could best support them and make sure they got the resources and the information that would be most useful to them. Now, I'll also say that carbon management and climate spaces in general can be really overwhelming, especially as someone without a background in it. And there were lots of moments where I felt really conflicted and confused about whether or not carbon management even made sense as a climate intervention. I read lots of reports about its cost or environmental justice communities' resistance to these technologies. There was one dinner I went to at the Society for Environmental Justice conference where I sat next to a professor who was very anti-carbon management. And I walked home to my hotel room, called my friend Raghavendra, and was like, oh my God, did I make a terrible mistake accepting this job? Like, am I doing the wrong thing? At the same time, I read lots of other reports that shared information about why carbon management is an essential tool in meeting our decarbonization goals and the hard to abate sectors where we don't really have other alternatives to think about decarbonizing. That messiness, that confusion, that back and forth really helped me sharpen my own understanding of where carbon management works and how I can communicate that to communities who might have gone through a similar process to me. So here's my first big takeaway. Carbon management does not make sense unless it's part of the big picture. The first real big point of clarity for me in my carbon management journey was having a big picture understanding of the big climate swings that we need to take in order to meet our goals. And the lion's share of that really is renewables. We need to find ways to accelerate geothermal, wind, solar, technologies that we've gotten really good at. But there's this other piece. There's this other piece that's more difficult to figure out that renewables might not get us to all the way. And carbon management can play a really incredible role in solving that slice of the pie. And when I got that broader sense of all the different pathways that we need to be on in order to meet our climate goals, and then what carbon management specifically could do, it clicked for me. Carbon management is contextual, it's specific, it works in particular cases, and in the cases that it works, it can really allow us to progress on our goals. I wanted to take that insight and think about how I could work with communities in order to develop long-term strategies to meet decarbonization goals, and where carbon management could fit as a part of that. Now, often when I've gone to conferences, there's big questions about community engagement. How do we do community engagement well? How do we create really successful buy-in? And my answer to that consistently is shared ownership. If you have a group of people that build something together, you don't need to worry about cultivating buy-in in the future. The buy-in is already there. I worked with a group of community-based organizations across the state of Mississippi called the Mississippi People's Movement. The Mississippi People's Movement was born out of an initiative a couple of years ago called Gulf South for a Green New Deal, where community-based organizations and local advocates in the South coalesced to think about what the South's role in articulating a green and equitable future could look like. I got connected with the Mississippi People's Movement, and the first thing I did was ask a lot of questions. I got a chance to set up interviews with people in Tupelo, in Jackson, on the Gulf Coast, in the Delta, and ask them what sort of energy future did they want to be a part of, and what sort of issues were they already dealing with right now. Major themes emerged around jobs. People were nervous about possibly losing their jobs because of a green transition, while also being optimistic that a just transition would create new, better jobs. People were really stressed about energy bills, and a lot of the church groups that I talked to shared how so much of their philanthropy was helping people pay their energy costs down. People shared a lot of frustrations around disaster response and how low-income communities of color often got the least amount of support. In having these conversations and getting a sense for what people cared about and what they were interested in, I hosted a climate learning convening to begin digging into these questions and these concerns and addressing a need that was regularly articulated in these interviews. People regularly recognized that climate change was a problem. They understood it was an issue, but they didn't really know the mechanics of it, much like I didn't before I started this fellowship. And they didn't know what role they could play in addressing climate change. That was the purpose of the climate learning convening. The Mississippi People's Movement gathered in Jackson, Mississippi for 2 days in October, and we did the basics. We worked with Dr. Leah Stokes, who shared with us an exceptional Climate 101 presentation, really starting at the beginning. What is climate change? What is carbon dioxide? How does it impact our atmosphere? And what are some of the different pathways we have available to start fighting it? I also worked with Dr. Simone Stewart from the National Wildlife Federation, who gave a really exceptional presentation on hydrogen and carbon management and talked about how those could be specific technologies used in specific cases where other technologies don't get us far enough to meet our climate goals. The most important part of this convening was a collective visioning exercise. We all sat together in a circle and talked about the type of future that we envisioned for Mississippi. What world did we want to live in? Now, when I was mapping out this activity, I thought the answer could go in two directions. The first is one around degrowth, where we buy less, where we consume less. Maybe we don't have cars, but we walk places we don't fly, and we reorient our economy so it's not so energy intensive. We do less. There's another possibility, another version where we value things like artificial intelligence, or we want to fly on planes or drive cars or have cement and steel for the industrial projects that we're interested in. And we want to do those things, but we want to do those things in right relationship with the planet and make sure that we're not harming our planet in pursuing those activities. Overwhelmingly, the Mississippi People's Movement selected that second option. They really wanted to live their lives in the way that they were living and wanted more for the people who didn't have access to those things that they saw as necessities. What that also allowed us to do is anchor ourselves with a vision. This is the world we're building towards. Now, what are the things that we need to do in order to achieve it without harming the planet? After the climate learning convening, I got to work building a just transition plan. This was a big picture strategy to consolidate the information that I had learned from the Mississippi People's Movement members about their priorities and coming up with policy strategies that worked well for them and a set of advocacy strategies so they could get those policies enacted. Over the course of this conversation with the Mississippi People's Movement, there was a lot I learned and deepened my knowledge about when it comes to working with communities. And I'll walk through these 5 points here. The first one is communities need investments in capacity. When you're doing long-term planning work, like a just transition plan or a just transition strategy, you're thinking 10, 15, 20 years into the future. But communities are overwhelmed right now. It's the people I was in community with who were doing rapid response work when a tornado happened and getting water to people and baby food to people. That doesn't allow them the space or the time to think about coming up with a climate strategy 15 years from now. But that long-term planning work is really important. And for organizations who do have the capacity to do that long-term strategic thinking, it's really important to work with communities and pour into their capacity so they can do similar sort of work or partner with organizations and do that work together. The next big takeaway is that Climate 101 education is essential and it's lacking. I think we assume too frequently that people know what climate change is, how it works, and the impacts that it has. And I think people, for the most part, have some sense of it. But things become a lot clearer when you have a foundational set of knowledge. And from there, you can make informed decisions around what sort of interventions are needed to meet those goals. Dr. Leah Stokes' presentation that really broke down definitions and helped Mississippi People's Movement members understand the processes that we participate in that result in greenhouse gas emissions, gave everyone a shared vocabulary to talk about and think about climate, and also allowed us to think about the interventions and policy recommendations that would work really well. The third is that trusted messengers go a long way. As Bridget mentioned in the introduction, the Great Plains Institute is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. We don't support specific projects. We don't oppose specific projects. We try to be a facilitative, independent, third-party group that puts people in a room together and allows them to make decisions. I've lived in Mississippi for 5 years now. I've been an educator. I've built a local nonprofit with students. I've done a lot of work in the community. And still, there's a lot of space for distrust. People in Mississippi People's Movement were like, who are you? Why are you doing this work? Who is funding you? What's happening? And it didn't really matter that I was earnest and excited and shared all those things. Um, Being a trusted messenger allows the work to move forward And I still had to build that trust with Mississippi People's Movement members by showing up consistently, answering their questions, letting them know my own perspectives and the work that I've done in Jackson and Mississippi. And that way they knew that my investment in Jackson, my investment in Mississippi and an equitable climate future was just as strong as theirs. Similarly, when we invited presenters to speak at the climate learning convening, I did the work of giving people options. I came up with 6 or 7 professors at universities that, are in no way affiliated with GPI or any organization. And Mississippi People's Movement members voted. They selected Dr. Leah Stokes and Dr. Simone Stewart to give the presentations. And really emphasizing the autonomy community members have and showcasing myself as an enabler of future work that Mississippi People's Movement members wanted to do went a long way in building trust. The next one is the importance of technological interventions from solar to carbon capture makes sense when put in context. I think a mistake I've often seen happen in the carbon management space is we talk so much about the specifics of the technology, like what is a capture facility, what does a pipeline do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's important. But if we don't start from a big picture framing where we talk about what percentage of the problem is this technology solving and why it matters so much, it's easy to get lost and start questioning why these technological interventions are necessary to begin with. And the last one is that long-term visioning enables short-term planning. If we're not clear about the future that we're looking towards, we're not going to be able to take small steps to reach it. This work is complex, as I've alluded to. It's really wonderful and empowering to work with community-based organizations because they're so invested in climate progress. We had a really wonderful convening where we had difficult conversations, asked lots of questions, and had this shared understanding of what we were working towards. People are motivated. They want to help their communities. They want Mississippi to be better. They were also really interested and excited to learn from trusted experts who had their best interests at heart. At the same time, it's complicated and difficult. In Mississippi, there's a long history of external partners, groups that are not from the state, that come in and make big promises or make commitments about work or funding or strategies that they'll share. And those partners are just bad partners. And it's not because they're bad people necessarily, but they're not good partners. Either other competing commitments come into play and they're not able to follow through on what they said they would do, or in bad situations, they can even create harm. So anytime a group is trying to work with Mississippi-based organizations, understanding those past experiences, that past trauma, those past failures of collaboration is really important so you can do future work in a more thoughtful, more successful way. Further, Mississippi People's Movement isn't organized hierarchically. There's not an executive director that I could consistently communicate with who would then communicate to other members what we would be doing next. It was a horizontal leadership structure. Everyone had some level of ownership. Decisions were made through consensus and reaching a 60% majority. And that slowed things down. That's not a bad thing necessarily, but it's important to recognize that with certain group structures, things aren't as easy as sending an email to 1 or 2 key leaders, but you have to work with the entirety of the organization in order to make sure that everyone's on board with what you're doing. Similarly, organizational discipline and constant crisis kind of go into one another. When you're faced with so much crisis, it's hard for the organization to both hold the short-term and the long-term goals. So sometimes the just transition work just had to be put on hold because other things were more pressing for the organization to deal with, and we had to work on them. Now, we've done the education work, we've done the trust building work, we've gotten to understand what communities in Mississippi are looking towards. How do we translate that towards a just transition? What I felt really proud of and excited about in crafting this just transition plan was that carbon management made it into the plan, made it into the strategy. It's about a 23-page document, and we talk about carbon dioxide removal, we talk about carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And we're really specific about where those technologies can work and what conditions need to bound them. So with carbon dioxide removal, we talk about DAC, and we also talk about nature-based carbon removal solutions. Similarly, with carbon capture, utilization, and storage, We talk about how carbon capture facilities could be great for something like a cement plant or a steel plant, but we don't want captured oil to be used for enhanced oil recovery. It was also really important to emphasize throughout the Just Transition Plan the necessity of community protections. So we highlight specifically cumulative impact assessments and community consent. So with cumulative impact assessments, if there's an assessment done about the project and the impact of that project is negative in some way, whether it's economic or health-based, that project is a no. Even if it has other sort of abstract benefits, if the cumulative impact assessments comes back saying that the project will be negative for local communities, it's not going to move forward. So that was a really essential and important protection into thinking about carbon management technologies, but also all the technological proposals in the Just Transition Plan. So wind, solar, agricultural decarbonization practices, these cumulative impact assessments are an essential guidepost. Similarly, community consent. In this case, it can feel a little stickier, even more frustrating, but in situations where the community is just like, no, like we hear all the science you're sharing with us, we hear everything that you're saying. When the community says no, they say no. And it's important for project developers and the state or any federal officials to hear that and to recognize that and to not move forward with something until there's an enthusiastic yes. The final piece of the Just Transition Plan is a series of advocacy pathways. In Mississippi, where things like Just Transition Plan are not landing on sympathetic ears, we still need to find ways to mobilize change for climate equity. One of those pathways that I'm really excited about is mobilizing around public service commissions. In Mississippi, public service commissioners are elected. So I shared with Mississippi People's Movement a resource on public service commissions, some background information about who our public service commissioners are, how a public service commission works, and how they can advocate as a part of those hearings. When public service commissioners are regulating utility companies, for example, Mississippi People's Movement members could ask, why haven't you asked, for Entergy or other utility companies to create a plan to move towards renewables? Or if there's a coal plant or a natural gas plant that's being proposed or extended, Mississippi People's Movement members could ask about the possibility of carbon management technologies to be deployed as well to avoid additional emissions. So the Just Transition Plan closes with a set of steps that Mississippi People's Movement members can take in order to adhere to the goals that we establish as a part of the plan. Now, I'll close with some big questions that I think are worth considering. What does it look like for organizations to really build community capacity? How can we move resources that we have, whether that's knowledge, whether that's money, whether that's connections, to community organizations who are on the ground, who really care about doing this work and support them in doing it really well? I think the Industrial Innovation and Carbon Management team at GPI has done a really wonderful job doing that with the structure of this fellowship, because it gives people who are from a place who might not have climate knowledge, but lots of local knowledge. It gives them climate knowledge and it connects them with a broader set of national resources to make sure that community needs are met. It's also really important for me to reflect on justice work. How do we do that as an internal practice? What am I doing as a human being to make sure that I'm working towards a more just and equitable world? How can organizations that we're situated in within GPI exercise that work more thoughtfully, especially in the political climate we're in now, where language like that is frowned upon? And then as a social practice, climate change requires vast levels of cooperation. How are we able to do that in a way where people's lives get better instead of worse? And I'll leave with this final question. What is the ideal world we are striving towards? What type of world do we want to live in? And then how can we enable it? Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. Bridget is going to ask me a couple moderated questions now, and then I really hope to hear from the audience and get into a deeper conversation from there.
Thanks so much, Vilas, and I see all of the applause coming in. Really appreciate the overview and thoughtful presentation. I'll kick us off with a couple questions, and it's great to see folks adding theirs in the Q&A function. Please continue to add your questions for Vilas. But first, Vilas, I wanted to ask you, you talked a little bit about um, the mistrust that can stem either from misinformation or from coming from somewhere else, or questions about who's funding you and why are you here, which I think is something that is really important and people see a lot. And so I'm curious if you could dig into that a little bit. What type of pushback did you encounter, and what strategies helped you move forward when facing friction or resistance from community members?
Yeah, absolutely. Most of Mississippi People's Movement's communication happens with a signal chat. So already you lose a lot of interpersonal conversational ability. It's hard to read tone on a signal chat. Like things can get escalated needlessly, or things can get missed via that form of communication. But when people are scattered all over the state, it's not easy to convene regularly and have difficult conversations. So I think part of that was the challenge of digital communication. You can just miss some of the conflict resolution strategies that you might otherwise be able to use. The other thing with the way communication often happened is people are receiving information from so many different sources. Some of them might be places like NPR or Politico. Others might be like Instagram threads or reels or information that people have seen on Facebook. And everyone's information diet is different. And I think everyone also feels really connected to and believes in the legitimacy of the information that they consume. So when that information enters into a space, uh, it's difficult to be like, oh, I'm not actually sure if that's true. One such example was talking about the amount of money the Inflation Reduction Act spent on certain tax credits. Somebody shared an analysis that was really different than any of the analyses I'd seen GPI put out. I think one way I could have made that situation worse is if I was like, hey, that's wrong. Like, you did a bad job. You found incorrect information. Let me tell you why I'm right. What I did, and I don't think this was like 100% successful, but what I tried to do is invite that into a larger conversation. And in engaging with that person, I was like, oh, that's really interesting that you found that. I found different numbers based on this information. I'm curious if you wouldn't mind sharing more about the information that you had. That way, it gives me a chance to share some of my knowledge and what I've learned, and open up a broader discussion. I think it was really important too for me in this process to not efface myself, but also not take up more space than I deserved or should or could take up. I think sometimes we get too nervous about sharing our own perspectives and thoughts on what's right and what's wrong. And I wanted to be able to do that. I wanted to be able to say, no, I think that climate information that you shared is incorrect, and I have like knowledge and ideas that support why that position makes sense, while also not overstepping and being like, the Mississippi People's Movement is my organization now, and like what I say goes. Like that's an extreme. So I think showing up as yourself and engaging as yourself is really essential, and it's how respect builds too.
Great, thank you for that answer. And it's funny how important it is to show up as yourself and how difficult that can be sometimes. I feel like it's something that everyone is always working on. All right, I have another question for you. So we got a little kind of preview of what the final product looked like, the Just Transition Plan. Bright colors, fun font. I know from working at different organizations, a lot of times final reports are a bit less exciting or colorful. And I'm curious how you were thinking about designing and presenting materials with the groups and community members that you worked with. What makes a final report or educational information exciting and usable for folks?
Yeah, I'll answer that question in two parts. The first one is the various books that I have on this slide that I didn't acknowledge. These are four books that are all fiction, science fiction, speculative fiction. And they single-handedly informed my approach to climate-related work, my passion for climate work, because they were, one, really thoughtful in their political analysis, their scientific analysis, and they did a lot of imaginative work. They helped me understand what an equitable climate future could look like or what a disastrous one could look like. None of these are, none of this is writing that the Department of Energy put out or is any sort of traditional academic research. It's narrative. It allows me to process information in a way that's accessible and allows me to remember it for a really long time. And I really believe that when we're working with the broad public, the groups that, like people who aren't reading DOE reports every day or academic work every day, the more narrative that we're able to do, the better. It sticks with people. It's interesting, it's fun, it's exciting, it feels relevant. And these books did that for me in a really substantive way. And I wanted to see what I could do as a part of the Just Transition plan to communicate a similar type of energy. So we have an amazing designer on our team named Kate Sullivan, and she really made this work come to life. Like you mentioned, Bridget, I wanted to have fun colors, bright colors, and fonts. There's a flower motif that goes throughout the plan that starts as a bud and then springs at the end. And the goal being ultimately that people read the document. You know, we spent a lot of time crafting this document, putting a lot of effort and energy into it. If you come up with a sterile Google Doc that nobody wants to read, then how successful are you really? And in crafting this plan, wanted to make it very narrative oriented. So sharing stories about Mississippi, sharing reflections from people's interviews with various quotes, using bullet points where it was relevant and necessary. So information was clear and jumped out instead of embedding it into really long paragraphs. And that thought, putting colors, fonts, easy to read material together, I think was a move towards making really complex climate information accessible and interactive.
Great, thanks so much. And I'll ask just one more question before we move to the audience questions. But kind of thinking of what you've learned in terms of whether it's designing materials or how to address mistrust, I'm curious in what ways existing community engagement practices, whether it's from other organizations that you've worked with or have observed, whether it's GPI itself, how that has informed your work here. And then on the flip side, how do you think your work can kind of inform the future work of these organizations and individuals who are doing this community engagement?
Yeah. The first phrase that came up for me with the first part of your question was around solidarity work. I think Carbon 180 does a really cool job of this with their grant making program. I believe they gave three different organizations some funds to just explore what carbon dioxide removal technologies looked like, and then have those organizations be in community with Carbon 180, but also figure out for themselves their role in understanding those technologies. I think that comes with like a deep sense of trust, right? You're saying, community-based organizations are full of bright, motivated, and thoughtful people. What's missing is capacity or energy to explore questions that they might not be able to otherwise. And we believe in these technologies. Like we see carbon management as an essential tool here. Like a bunch of like world climate organizations like the IPCC agree with us too. But it doesn't matter if communities don't have the same time or energy to engage with those technologies and fully understand what they are and their implications. I think GPI did that with this fellowship and us in our facilitative roles too, of like putting people in a room together, presenting them with information and giving them time and space to reflect on it, chew on it, and figure out if those technologies work for their communities and they could be advocates. That goes a long way. With that, I think it activates this sense of shared decision-making structure where you have a bunch of people who collectively agree on what the future needs to look like, and we have some sort of consensus around what technologies enable that future. And when people feel heard, when they recognize that the things that they're saying matter and are incorporated into processes, I think communities and developers and nonprofits and governments, all of them work together a lot better. in thinking about next steps and the future, um, I think visioning activities and education activities need to be thought of in different ways. From my understanding, a lot of education activities are like one-offs or two-offs. You do like maybe a town hall or a community meeting about a specific project or about a specific technology. You're like, okay, this is the technology. Any questions? Or like maybe you do that two times. But, I think if you talk to any teacher, you'll be like, you can tell a kid something 1,000 times, and like maybe there's a 20% chance that it sits with you. Adults aren't kids, like I'm not making a parallel there. But in thinking about the way I process information, something needs to be told to me a bunch of different times and often in different ways. It can't be the same thing repeated. And I think understanding the complexity and challenges of climate change are similar. And we have an opportunity here to help communities understand the complexities of climate in a way that's sustained, that's long term, that enables bringing together different community partners with all sorts of independent expertise that affirm the same message. I think the other part of that is visioning. So uh, by doing that long-term visioning and mapping work of what we want our community to look like 15 and 20 years from now, the intermediate steps make a lot more sense. And people understand why we're doing the things that we're doing and how in the long term our goal is to improve the lives of communities.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, I will move on to some of the questions that have been submitted in the chat from the audience. The first one here from Miranda. So, Blas, you talked about degrowth as kind of one of the pathways that can be considered when you're thinking about how to reduce carbon emissions. And so Miranda says, her understanding is that degrowth is specifically focused on reducing emissions in sectors which are not essential to ordinary people's well-being, starting with luxury industries, the wealthiest groups, the global north, and working down from there, rather than asking under-resourced or marginalized communities to give up what they have now or their aspirations for having more in the future. So can you talk about a little bit more about if that's your understanding of degrowth, and if not, how would that understanding change your framing around degrowth versus green growth?
Yeah. So I think this conversation is situated within a broader debate that's happening in climate spaces. One is the sort of quote unquote sacrifice model where less happens in our economy. And as a result of that, fewer emissions are released as well. The other is this abundance framework that we can, in fact, have all the things that we want and that we care about, and we can achieve those through technological innovation. I think I fall sort of somewhere in the middle within like this donut framework that an economist named Kate Raworth articulated, where there are essential human needs that we all need to meet: housing, income security, gender equality, et cetera, et cetera. There's a set of basic needs that are essential for people's lives to be good and flourishing. There's also limits on our planet. We can only extract so much, we can only cut down so many trees, we can only fish so much in our oceans. There's some scientifically defined planetary boundaries. And what Kate Raworth describes as the donut is that perfect middle zone where we're able to meet the needs of people without overextending planetary bounds. Now, I don't have enough knowledge or expertise to know which specific sectors require us to, move away from them as sectors in our economy, and which ones are really essential. I think that's actually the work of communities for them to decide what is essential and really important for their flourishing to happen, and where a lot of this community-based work goes. But I do feel resistant to this idea of like endless growth and like continuing to grow as the only sort of pathway for human flourishing. And I'm also resistant to the idea that if we just completely scale back and stop consuming and producing, we'll be in a better place. And that perfect middle of the donut where we respect human dignity and what people need without overextending planetary bounds feels really essential. And the last quick thing I'll say about that, about planetary bounds, is we've already extended them in really dramatic, terrible ways. That's why we're in the situation that we're in right now. So when I think about something like carbon dioxide removal, part of that is getting back into right relationship with our environment because there's too much CO2 in the air already.
Thank you. And I will encourage folks to submit any other questions they have as we move to the last one in the Q&A for now. First, I want to acknowledge the Go Veloz in all caps with 4 exclamation points. And then the question, what has surprised you the most about this work and community engagement?
Hmm. I'm sort of amazed that people have the energy to keep going. I often am like, what are we doing this for? Like, what's the point of all of this? The people in power aren't really listening. I live in a state where there's a supermajority of one party and climate change is a taboo. Like, what sort of policy pathways are actually reasonable or possible? And what I find time and time again is people are like, these are our lives. These are our futures. These are our young people. Like, it doesn't matter how hard anything is. We're going to keep fighting and working no matter what to and ensure a secure and safe climate future. And that's really inspiring and touching in a way that I regularly forget and I'm pleased to remember again. And I think it also gives me guidance when I think about overcoming these big challenges. The work that we're doing is so essential. It doesn't matter how difficult the obstacles are, you just have to do it. And it was amazing for me to see so many people who didn't have climate expertise necessarily recognize that in the work that I was doing, were so eager to take time away from their regular lives to engage in it and learn from it, and are constantly thinking about how to implement those strategies because they care about the people around them and want to do good things.
Thanks for that wonderful sentiment. We've had a couple other questions submitted. One references the degrowth model that you were discussing, acknowledging that ideally we find that perfect middle. But how do we make decisions and have conversations when community feedback is not in alignment with environmental bounds?
I think I would maybe reframe that approach a little bit. We're never stuck in time. There's never a point at which a community says something and that's it forever, or a developer says something and that's it forever. It's important to say and honor the dignity of communities and the ownership and autonomy they have over the places that they live in. I'm not denying that by any means. But I think it also means if there's an instance where, like, let's take a coal plant, for example, like a coal plant is really essential to the lifeblood of a community, but also causes various sorts of environmental harms. Are there third paths? Are there other ways to work with communities and get them to feel excited about alternative economic futures that maintain and uplift and celebrate their dignity while also making sure that the climate benefits? One of the examples I came across in Mississippi was around car manufacturing. There is a big Nissan plant in Canton, and a lot of workers are concerned that any transition to electric vehicles will result in layoffs. You can both hold the value of more electric vehicles in the United States and recognize that workers in a community don't want to lose their jobs because there's a transition that's happening. So I think in any sort of situation like that, it's important to be flexible and reflect on what alternatives might exist to get at the need that communities are like really articulating, which might be jobs, which might be like concerns around health and safety or any number of other things, and see if you can work with them and imagine and think about an alternate solution. I'm also not pretending like this work is easy and that like in every situation there is a third way or something else that works. But I think that with time and space and energy and doing that education work and trust building work and long-term organizing work, it is possible to get to the transition in a way that's equitable and uplifts the voices of communities.
Thanks. And there's one other question that's submitted here that, unless others come through, I think is a really beautiful one to end on. And that is, what is something you've learned about people uniquely through this work?
Hmm. My friend Sam said this to me once, and it felt true time and time again in the work that I've seen in Mississippi. Anger is a sense of justice that's misplaced. Like when people are angry, when they're frustrated, they're seeking justice. And I think too often we penalize and criticize people for being angry or upset, but in reality, they are seeking a right to a wrong. They want a thing that has been harmful to not be harmful anymore, or a new outlook that isn't currently available to them or accessible to them. And like politics is often about conflict and wanting one group to do something that they might not often want to do. And regularly, a resulting feature of that is anger. And I think it's really made me reflect on what are the things that make people angry and how can we address them in a way that's dealing with the justice issue that they're really naming and making sure that yeah, the paths that we take are around addressing justice and equity and dignity, rather than focusing on like where maybe the anger or frustration or the emotions that are so integrated into this work come from.
Thanks, Vilas. Well, I will hand it back to you so you can provide any last or closing thoughts. But first, I will just give you a sincere thank you, both personally and on behalf of GPI, for all of the wonderful work that you've done. Um, and we just really, really appreciate everything that you have brought to this work. So, um, yeah, please leave us with any concluding thoughts. And there's also a request for a link to the transition plan if you have that handy.
Yeah, I think I slacked it to you, Bridget, if you wouldn't mind putting it in the chat. But yeah, thank you all so much for taking the time out of your day to listen to my journey. I'm so new in this space. I have so much more to learn. And I'm hopeful and excited that I'll be able to do that with people who really care about equity and justice and ensuring that we secure a really good climate future for ourselves and future generations. So thank you all so much again. And yeah, I hope you'll get in touch if you're interested in collaborating, thinking through more of these projects with GPI, with us. So yeah, we can collaborate and do more things together.